In this lecture, we're going to talk about insert multi-mesh brushes. So if we go to B for brush, I for insert, we're going to be talking about these brushes here and how to use them both with and without Dynamesh. We're going to create a small mech object using the insert mesh brushes for bolts and nuts. And then later on, we're going to use it in conjunction with Dynamesh to create a creature like this, simply building it up out of primitives and then Dynameshing them together using the insert multi-mesh brushes for primitives as well as body parts. So let's go ahead and get started taking a look at insert multi-mesh brushes. Now we're going to take a look at a specific type of insert mesh brush. If I go to B for brush, I for insert, you see that there's a variety of IMM brush sets here, such as machine parts or industrial parts or model kit. Now these brushes consist of lots of little mechanical pieces. Now you can Dynamesh these into another mesh, but generally they're used to create standalone pieces. If I want to add a sense of scale or complexity to an object, I'll use these and it will add extra geometry that doesn't blend in with the existing mesh. Because you don't necessarily want to Dynamesh little hard surface pieces together like that. I find, far easier to keep your fasteners separate. So brushes like this have a tendency to be used in that capacity. For example, model kit. Again, these are all nice little hard surface greebles, just little surface details you can use to add extra bits of information to a model. So here I've got a mesh that was created using live Boolean. I'm going to turn on my X symmetry and let's put some fasteners on here. I'll select from the model kit brush this fastener, which is a nut, a bolt, and a washer. If I click and drag, it'll draw onto the canvas. Let's undo that and do it again. Let's select this one. Click and drag, and that draws onto the canvas. Now, you'll notice that it masks the rest of the model. That's so I can select the transpose gizmo, and then I can move these things around individually, independently of the mesh that I drew them on. Clear the background, or clear the mask, and they're now part of the model. Now, they're still separate parts. If I go into frame mode, you can see these actually are separate pieces, but they're in the same subtool. Now, when we're drawing fasteners like this, often we want them all to be the same size. It would be very strange if we drew a bunch of nuts and bolts and they were not the same size. So what I do is I change my draw size, turn it down, click and drag, and as I'm drawing, press the Control key, and it will snap it to the draw size of my brush. So let's do that again. Let's add another fastener here. We'll put two fasteners right here, click and drag, and then press Control, and it will snap to the size of my brush. It locks into that size, let go, and there we go. We'll do two more here. Press Control and that locks them into the correct size. So let's add some more pieces down here. Let's select a different part now. Let's grab this coupler here. This is an interesting shape. I will click and drag. If I press Control, it snaps it to the size of my brush. If I want to change that, I just undo, turn my brush size up, click and drag, and then press Control, and it snaps it to that larger size. Let's come over here. So we're on X symmetry right now. We should be able to draw another one right here. Press Control, and it snaps to the same size, but it's a little bit in the wrong position here, so I'm going to go to W for Move, unlock the gizmo, and just reset it, and then we'll just scooch it over here ever so slightly so it's sitting in the right position. And there we go. Clear our mask, and let's take a look at some other parts. We'll go to B for brush, I for insert multi-mesh, and go to, let's say, industrial parts. Grab a pipe. If we rotate over to this side here, click and drag, press the Control key. Again, it locks that to the size of my brush. So we've added a pipe on this side. If we were to, let's say, change our symmetry, let's undo that. And let's go to go to Transform, and let's change to Z symmetry, and then we'll do this again. Let's change our draw size. Let's make it a bit bigger. Click and drag, and then press the Control key, and that will snap that brush to the correct size. Go to W for Move, and we can scooch those up, and maybe I just want to countersink them into the model just a little bit. Then clear the mask. Now, if I go into frame mode, you see all of our insert mesh brushes have a separate polygroup. So if I want to change these, I can always Control-Shift-Click on that polygroup, mask it, and then invert the mask and go back to our gizmo. Maybe I want to rotate these 90 degrees or 180 degrees. We'll rotate them by 180 degrees, scooch them down, and now they're pointing in a different direction. So the insert multi-mesh brushes are extremely powerful, and if they're being used just as independent parts such as this, or if they're being blended into a mesh using Dynamesh, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, each one of these meshes, you'll notice it has a specific orientation when it's drawn on the surface. That is to say that when I draw one of these bolts, the bolt draws onto the surface in the correct orientation. It's sitting face down against that surface. The orientation that your insert multi-mesh brush draws in is based on the orientation of the model when the brush is created. So we'll talk about how to create our own brushes, and you'll understand what I mean by that. Each one of these objects has its own orientation at the time the brush was stored. Now also, you need to make sure that you're only using these on a mesh that has a single subdivision level. Now, if you still need to see your mesh smoothed, you can always use dynamic subdivision levels, and we talk about this more in the chapter on ZModeler. If I press the D key, which you'll remember is the hotkey to step up your subdivision levels, if I have no subdivision levels, it's going to ask me if I want to use dynamic subdiv. So I'll say yes, and now you see that those faceted parts are now smooth. Now, if I want to change the settings of my dynamic subdivision levels, I'll go to the Geometry menu and I'll go to Dynamic Subdivisions. And here I can adjust things like the flat subdivision levels, just that, and that changes the nature of that smooth. I can also apply this. So if I'm happy with my work, I like what I've got. Let's do another piece here though before we move on. Let's grab this piston, which if I were to turn off dynamic subdivision levels and draw this piston, you'll see what we end up with. We'll click and drag. That draws the piston. You see the piston is faceted by design. Let's rotate that and scale it down just a bit. And let's center the pivot. And then let's send it to the home so we can actually make sure that it's perfectly centered. Bring that out and then just countersink that in a little bit. Now, clear my mask and you see that everything that is faceted. However, if I turn back on my dynamic subdivision levels, those faceted pieces now appear smooth. So this allows us to use insert multi-mesh brushes on a hard surface object that doesn't have subdivision levels but is giving us a sense of smoothing, so we can see what it will properly look like. Now when I'm happy with this, I click apply, and that has now applied that as subdivision levels to the model. Now I would only want to do that if I've decided that I'm finished adding in insert multi-mesh brushes, because again, you cannot use insert mesh brushes on a mesh that has multiple subdivision levels. So let's take a look now at how we create our own insert meshes. So here I have a slightly more complicated version of our previous model. It's a single subtool. It's been created using live Boolean, so it's been Boolean meshed down into one object. You see that it actually has 33,000 faces, and that's something to consider when you create an insert mesh brush. If it's too high density and you're planning on using lots of them, then that's going to add up. So you may actually want to go in here and decimate this. I don't have the lines turned on polyframe. So if we turn on the lines, you can see the polyframe lines here. So if something gets a bit too dense, you may consider decimating it before you turn it into an insert mesh brush. Now, when I generate an insert mesh brush, I need to be aware of the orientation of the model when I store it as a brush. So for example, all these brushes up here, you remember the flathead, for example, this draws in a specific orientation. Well, that's because this was stored when it was created as a brush in that orientation. So the way we orient our model is to consider the background, the surface of the mesh that this insert mesh brush will be drawn onto. So if I store my mesh like this, it will draw with this facing out. If I store my mesh like this, it will draw with the side facing down. If I store my mesh like this, it will draw upside down. So let's begin by orienting it like this. And then we simply go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh. And we want to make a new insert mesh brush right there. So now if I click and drag, it draws that new tool or that new brush in that stored orientation. Now if I want to change the depth at which it draws, I go to Brush, Depth, and then I change this depth control. And now if I click and drag, you see it actually draws deeper into the surface. Now let's say this is an object that I actually want to store various orientations of. If I change to this orientation and then go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh, I have the option to append it. So if I append it, it is now a second version stored in this single brush. And maybe we want one that draws upside down, so we'll orient it this way and go to Brush, Create, Create Insert Mesh, Append. So now I have an Insert Mesh brush with 3 different orientations. So if I select one, draw it, then I can select another one, draw that, select this one, draw that. You see each one draws at a different orientation. Now, there's another way of creating an insert multi-mesh brush, and this I find very, very handy. Here I've got a model of a human skeleton where each bone is a separate subtool. Now, if I want, I can create an insert multi-mesh brush from this Z tool simply by going to Brush, Create, and this time click Create Insert Multi-Mesh. And it's going to take a moment to think about it. And now here you see we have an insert multi-mesh brush for all these parts. If I click and drag, let's go back to our piece here that it just has one subdivision level. Click and drag, I'm drawing skulls. If I select this one, I'm drawing scapulas. If I select this one, I'm drawing the, looks like that is the radius bone. Grab this one. There we have our humerus. So each one of these is a separate bone, and that each one of those are extracted from the individual subtools of that mesh. So it's quite an interesting opportunity here to create some very macabre abstract art. Clear my mask, and there we go. Now let's take a look at using insert mesh brushes with Dynamesh. I'll begin by going to the light box, and under the tool menu within the light box, I'll just select a polysphere. We'll draw that on the canvas and go into edit mode. Make sure that we're looking down the Z-axis with our guide head here, and turn on X symmetry. Now we're just going to use Dynamesh and insert mesh brushes to create a creature head. I'll begin by creating an egg shape from the front. We'll snap to a side view and create an egg shape or create the cranial mass from the side. Do a little bit of smoothing here. Snap to a top view, and let's create an egg shape from the top. I'll step down a couple subdivision levels. We're still in subdivision sculpting mode, and I like to start in that mode. If you've watched the quick start or any of the other sculpting demos, you'll see I talk a lot about the importance of subdivision levels for getting good basic form before we move into Dynamesh. So let's just get an interesting shape here. I'll go to the magnify brush, do a little bit of magnification here. Let's turn down the Z intensity on that brush so it's not quite so strong. And I'll go back to my move brush, stretch these shapes down. Now once I've got a generalized form established, I'll go to Geometry. I will go to the Dynamesh menu, and here I can set my resolution for Dynamesh. Right now it defaults at 128, so if I press the Dynamesh button here, it notices that I have subdivision levels and it asks me if I want to freeze them. I'll just tell it no. I just want to do a clean Dynamesh here. Go into frame mode and you can see what it's done. If I undo that and then do it again, it's basically dynamically subdivided the model, creating a whole bunch of little quads, evenly spaced, to represent that shape based on the 128 resolution. So I'm just going to hit it with the smooth brush to take away those facets, because those facets don't exist as polygons anymore. They're just baked in because those were the shapes when I generated my mesh. So let's create a neck. Turn my draw size down and press the Control key to activate the masking brush, and we'll just mask out where the neck will come from. Control click on the background to invert that mask and take the move brush, and I'll just stretch those faces down for the neck. Control click and drag once to execute Dynamesh. If we go into frame mode, you'll see when I control click and drag again, that executes Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is dynamic subdivision, dynamic remeshing. So what happens is each time I control click and drag on the background, it will rebuild my mesh to this resolution that I've established here. So I've got sort of a basic shape going. Now let's put in a torso. I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and we're back in the IMM brushes here. Now, previously we were using the nuts and bolts, the IMM brushes that are really specifically for meshes that are not being dynameshed. Now I'm going to select IMM primitives, and this is just a selection of primitive meshes here. If I select Sphere 32, click and drag, it draws a sphere here on the canvas. Let's do this again. Let's go ahead and click and drag, draw a sphere. There we go. Now it masks out the mesh that I drew it from. If I go to W for move, I can click and drag and position the sphere. Go to my move brush, and now I'll just start shaping this into a torso. Just want to get the general volumes of rib cage here. Let's create the thoracic arch there. Let's go to E for scale. Let's scale it up a little bit, bring this down. Go back to our move brush. Look at it from the underside and just make sure that we get a nice peak to the rib cage here. All right, now if we go into frame mode, you'll see this sphere is a separate object from the Dynamesh that we've been working on. The Dynamesh is currently masked. Every time I use an insert mesh brush, it will mask the mesh that I'm inserting it into. So the first step is to control click and drag on the background to clear the mask. Now anytime Dynamesh is turned on, if I control click and drag on the background again with no mask, it will Dynamesh those parts. So you see it's just blended those two pieces together. They've maintained their polygrouping, but they are now a single mesh. So I'll just come back here, do a little bit of smoothing on this, and here we go. So let's add some shoulders in. I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and go back to my IMM primitives. I'll take that same sphere, and this time I will click and drag, and that will draw two spheres for shoulders. W for move, I'll just place these. And then I'll take the move brush once again, and I'm just going to pull out the suggestion of clavicles here. And from the back, I'll take my move brush, and I will suggest the scapulas. Let's lower these down a little bit. And then I'll take the move brush and just push in the underside there of the deltoid. I want to make sure that there's some depth to that armpit. So I can use these primitives to build up a character, primitive by primitive, in its most basic volumes. And it's a very, very valuable way of working. It's one of my favorite ways of sculpting, actually, is to establish these basic shapes first and foremost by building them up with sort of virtual balls of clay like this. Control click and drag once clears the mask. Control click and drag a second time Dynameshes these parts together. So if I smooth, we can smooth those transitions. I'll take the move brush and continue to sort of adjust these shapes. Now let's look at a different insert multi-mesh brush. I'll do B for brush, I for insert. And we have one here called IMMB parts. That's body parts. And you see this is a selection of all sorts of different body parts here. I'm going to grab the full arm. Click and drag, and that draws a full arm. But the orientation obviously isn't quite right. So we'll press E to bring up our gizmo. And then we'll rotate and move and scale these. So let's hold down the Alt key, and we'll change the pivot point up here to the shoulder. We'll scale the arms up. Maybe rotate them down just a bit. Rotate them forward and position. Now I want these arms to be a little bit more slender and a little bit more creaturey, so to speak. Let's go to move, and I still have the mesh masked that I'm inserting this into. So here I'm able to just use the move brush to kind of adjust these shapes. I want to make sure that that deltoid or that bicep tucks up under the deltoid there. And now I'm going to mask out this area here. I'll go back to my gizmo, and I'll turn off the gizmo so I have the transpose line now. And I will click and drag to draw a new transpose line. Move the transpose line so it's basically running right down the axis of the arm. And I'll go to W for move, and I'll grab the outermost circle, and I can just stretch those arms down a bit. And let's mask down to the forearm. And I'll do the same thing here. I'll draw a new transpose line from the elbow out. And I just want to make sure that it's actually running along the axis of that forearm. I kind of place the transpose line where the bone would be. W for move, and just grab the outermost circle to stretch that down. And it has the added benefit that it kind of elongates the fingers a bit. Now I'll clear my mask. And I still want to do some changes to these arms. I don't want to Dynamesh them yet. So if I go into frame mode, you see it's a separate polygroup. So I can Control-Shift-Click on it, mask them, and then invert the mask so I still have the Dynamesh masked. I will mask out the hands, mask out the shoulders, and I'm going to go to Deformation under the Tool menu. And there is an Inflate slider here, and I'm just going to turn that Inflate slider down ever so slightly, and that will make those arms a little bit more slender. Clear my mask, and now I'm going to mask out the hands and invert that mask. I'm going to take my move brush and just sort of stretch out these fingers a little bit. Now when we're Dynameshing, if your resolution is not set high enough, things like fingers and toes may very well blend together. If you find that problem where your fingers are sort of blending into each other, increase your resolution in your Dynamesh by going to Geometry, Dynamesh, and increase the resolution. Or what I like to do is go to my transpose line, hold down the Control key, and click and drag, and that masks based on topology. You can see this in the transpose chapter. I'll draw a new transpose line ending the circle at the joint of the knuckle, go to R for rotate, and hold down the Alt key and just click and drag. And what I'm doing here is I'm spreading these fingers out just a little bit. I think it'll make it a lot easier for us to actually sculpt the hands if the fingers are a little bit spread, and helps us get a more expressive shape. Hold down the Alt key and I'll spread that index finger out, and then I'll mask down to the ring finger and do the same. I will rotate that ring finger out slightly. Now I draw a new transpose line and go to W for move, and let's stretch that ring finger out. Let's mask down to the middle finger, stretch that middle finger out, and mask down to the index finger, and we can stretch that index finger out again, just using the last circle in the move brush. Now, since it's a creature, I think it might be interesting if the carpals were a little bit longer, so we'll stretch those a bit. Actually, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to use the middle circle here. Hold down the Shift key, and I can stretch the length of that hand. Clear my mask, and I'll just use the move brush to do a little bit of adjustment to the shapes of the fingers here. And there we go. So we've got the hand shapes change now. It's a bit larger. It's a nice kind of stylization. Of course, if I wanted to overall change that, I could mask it, go to my gizmo. We'll turn the gizmo back on here, and you can actually change your scale here using your scale slider. Now, if I Control, click, and drag once, it will clear the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time. I'll turn on frame mode so you can see this. It will Dynamesh these arms into the torso. And here we are. So we're building up a character bit by bit, doing what some people call kit bashing, which is just taking various bits and pieces from other models and blending them together. So here actually I've got a little mistake. You can see where those bits of the arm extend out. So what I'll do is I'll mask that, invert the mask, and I'll just take the Clay Tubes brush and hold down the Alt key, and that just pushes those in. Let's turn off the alpha, and then I'll just smooth that area out a little bit. Smooth that back, and then I'll Dynamesh it again, and you see it will actually correct that area. I treat Dynamesh as a tool for generating volumes. I use it to sketch out characters, but once I have the overall volume of my character established, then I like to leave Dynamesh mode and go back into subdivision modeling mode, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Let's go ahead and bring this down to the pelvis. We'll do a torso for this character. I'll do B for brush, I for insert, and go back to my IMM primitives. Select a sphere, and I'll just draw in a sphere here for the abdomen. Take the move brush, and I'll start to shape this. I'll bring that abdomen down. And here I'll start to suggest the iliac crest. That's the uppermost crest of the pelvis. Bring this down to the pubic bone. Bring that up into the thoracic arch. And let's bring this out here. This will be the lateral oblique, the flank muscle. Let's go to the standard brush and just push in a little bit there for the lumbar spine. And let's invert the mask. And I'm just going to push in a little bit here for the spine itself, because that does go in. Suggest our 7th cervical vertebrae there. And then we'll invert the mask again, take our move brush, and just transition these shapes together a little bit better. There we go. Then when I'm happy with that, I Control, click, and drag once to clear the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time, and that blends these two pieces together, Dynameshing them into one form. Now, lastly, we'll put in the pelvis. So I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and let's go back to our primitives. We'll take that same sphere and just draw two spheres here for the buttocks. We'll use the gizmo to move them together. Go to our move brush, and now we're just going to basically fill out the muscles that attach to the pelvis and the legs. That'd be the tensor fasciae lata and the rectus femoris and vastus lateralis and medialis. Let's get that all down in here. Get the shape of the gluteus maximus here. Control, click, and drag twice, and that will blend these two shapes together. This is very similar to how I would sculpt in clay. I would roll out balls of clay and put together the basic shapes, the basic volumes of a character first and foremost, and then smooth between them. So bring this pelvis back a little bit, and there we go. So now we can start sculpting in the shapes of the head. I'll go to the clay tubes brush once again, and I'll begin just by creating that sternocleidomastoid muscle, the biggest muscle, the neck, that attaches to the clavicles and to the mastoid process of the skull. Now, if I go into frame mode, this is quite dense, and I really don't need this much density for the type of sculpting that I'm doing right now because I'm just basically roughing in forms. So if I want to change my resolution, I'll come back here to the Dynamesh resolution and maybe turn it down to 80. I'll just touch the model once and then control, click, and drag, and it will Dynamesh again, but this time it will reduce the overall polygon count. See, that's reduced now. I could bring that down further if I bring it to, let's say, 50, well, 48. Touch the model and then control, click, and drag. And you see that begins to really reduce that overall polygon count. Let's set it to 32. Control, click, and drag, and there we go. Now we've got a nice sort of basic shape. The fingers have been spread out. We want to make sure as we're Dynameshing that we don't end up losing fingertips or getting holes in places, because that is a danger when you start to lower your resolution. But now my smoothing works much, much better. So I'm just going to smooth out these shapes here. Let's go in with our standard brush. Let's create eye sockets. Take our clay tubes brush, start to suggest some bone structure here like a muzzle, cheekbones, temporal ridge of the skull. Let's go ahead and mass out that cranium again. Let's get an interesting shape here. We'll go back to our magnify brush, turn up our draw size, and just do a little bit of magnification here. Take the move brush and let's pull this out into kind of a crest. Spread those eyes out. Come to the back and let's just spread the cranial mass out. Go to the top. Always work from various angles too. Make sure that you're not constantly working from the front view of your character, because that will be very, very misleading to you. I'm going to go to my clay tubes brush and turn the Z intensity down. Just hold down the Alt key to create the planes on the side of the head here. Go to our clay tubes brush and build up these cheekbones again. Get that structure of the skull. Clay tubes brush for this muzzle. We're going to put tentacles on the face here, so it's not going to be sort of a standardized mouth. I want to start creating just a sense of there being some kind of bone structure here. Even though it's an alien structure, I just want it to feel like there's some physiological truth, there's some physiological motivation for the shapes that we're making. So I'm pulling what I know about facial anatomy and trying to incorporate that into this sort of alien shape. Take our move brush, open those up, take the clay tubes brush, and let's just build up this muzzle shape here. I'll go to my damn standard brush, and I'm just going to carve out this shape here. I'm just going to push these shapes up inside the mouth, smooth that back a bit. Maybe we'll just go ahead and mask this area. Invert that mask and take the move brush and just tug them up and in. And then control, click, and drag twice, and it will Dynamesh those shapes. Take our move brush and let's pull that out. And let's go with our clay tubes brush and let's put some ears on here. I'm going to mask out the shape of the ear. Now, when we're getting into details like this, we might actually need to increase our resolution. So we'll have to go back up in our resolution. I've just unmasked the shape of the ear, and I'll take the move brush and just pull that shape out, like so. Pull that out from the head so it's sitting at a bit of an angle. Control, click, and drag twice, and that will dynamically subdivide. It will dynamically remesh that. Take our standard brush, and let's just hold down the Alt key and just push in the inner ear a little bit. Take the move brush, tug the earlobe down, tweak the shape of that ear. Let's take the inflate brush and let's inflate those earlobes and pull them down a little bit so they're a little bit sort of pendulous. Let's take our move brush and I'm just going to adjust these cheekbones a little bit. Pull out the brow and pull out the frontal eminence of the skull here just a little bit. I'm going to mask out the face. Control click on that mask to feather the edge, and then I'll just hold down the Alt key and I'll just pull those brow shapes forward. And that just gives us a bit more interesting silhouette there, a little bit more going on in the overall profiles. Let's bring this muzzle shape out a little bit more. And let's spread these out just a bit. Going with my damn standard brush, I'm just going to put a little crease through here. Just put some little details in here. Maybe this is the esophagus or the mouth right under there. We're going to have tentacles coming out of the face here in just a moment, in case you're wondering what's going on with this strange thing that we're making. I'm just going to put a little bit of detail here inside of those eye sockets. And now I think we could increase our resolution just a little bit. So I'll go to my resolution slider and I'll set this back to 50. Go into frame mode, and if I control, click, and drag, you see that that automatically increases my resolution. So we'll leave frame mode, do a little bit of smoothing in the ear. And I'm going to mask out the inner portion of the ear here. Invert that mask, take the clay tubes brush, and we'll create the inside part of the ear called the antihelix. That's the little Y-shaped portion of the ear you'd be familiar with. It's got the little divot right here. We're just going to build that up. Invert that mask, and I just want to build out the outermost portion of the ear, which is called the helix. And then we'll dynamesh that. Do a little bit of smoothing on it. Take our standard brush and I'll push in the ear hole. That's called the auditory meatus. And I'll take the move brush and I'll pull out a little divot of skin right here. That's called the tragus. Hit that with the inflate brush and then execute dynamesh. Now here you see, because it was a low resolution, those two parts blended together. So I'm going to undo that and just take my move brush and just pull this slightly away. I want to make sure that these two parts don't blend together too much. Now I could correct that by just increasing my resolution again. That is another option. Go to my damn standard brush, accentuate that crease between the helix and antihelix. And we've got the ability to make this a little bit of an alien ear. It doesn't have to be a perfectly human ear, but I do like to base things in some kind of biological reality. There we go. Smooth that just a little bit. Now, I could add eyeballs here and merge them in using the IMM primitives. If I just selected a sphere, I could just insert spheres here and use these as eyeballs themselves. I'm not going to do that though, but I am going to use them as eyelids. So I'm going to place these inside the eye sockets like so, and control, click, and drag twice, and that will blend them in. Now I'll do a little bit of smoothing along that transitional edge. Now I'm going to go to Subtool, Append, and I'm going to append a polystar. Select that polystar and go into Move Gizmo, bring it forward. Hit the little gear icon here and we'll change that sphere into a polysphere. Add a subdivision level or two. We're not going to dynamesh these eyeballs into the head. We're going to leave them separate. I'll turn on transparency, and I basically want to get them placed just behind that eyeball sphere that we just inserted. I'll scale them down just a tick and just make sure that they're sitting just behind that eyeball. I'll select the body again. Let's turn off transparency. Now at this stage, I really do need to add more geometry. So again, I don't add subdivision levels because I'm in Dynamesh mode. I simply increase my Dynamesh resolution. So let's bring it up to 100, 104. Control, click, and drag. and that will increase the Dynamesh resolution. Use my masking brush now to mask the shape of an open eye. And let's Control-Alt to erase out the mask where we've overpainted it. And for the bottom here as well, we just want to adjust that shape of that open eye. Control-click on the background to invert that mask, and take the Move brush, hold down the Alt key, and then you can push those faces in, revealing the eyeball subtool. I'll leave that little white bit there, invert my mask by Control-clicking on the background, go to the Standard brush, and build up the shapes around that. That's called the medial canthus. Sometimes it's called the tear duct. It's a nice little landmark on the eye. Take the Inflate brush and inflate that thickness of the eyelid. Go to the Clay Tubes brush, build up into the recess there. Let there be a little bit of a soft tissue or an eye bag here. Go to my damp Standard brush and put a little bit of a crease right through here. And then we'll execute Dynamesh, and you see that it will rebuild this area. And we can hit it with a little bit of smooth now. Now I want to mirror that eyeball over, so I'll go back to my Subtool menu, select the eyeball. I'll go to Z Plugin, Subtool Master, Mirror, and I want to merge into one subtool across the X-axis. Click OK, and now I've got two eyeballs merged into a single subtool. Let's select the body again, take the Move brush, and let's just play around with the shapes that we're getting. Let's mask out this muzzle. Once again, Control-click on the mask to feather it, and I just want to furrow these brow shapes down a little bit. I'm going to mask out the inside of the eye area and Control-click on that mask a couple times to feather it. And from the top view, I just want to make sure that that brow bone comes out far enough. We can tuck this down a little bit and just add a little bit of sort of malicious intent. We'll invert that mask and let's bring this up. Go to our damp Standard brush and just create a couple little creases here. Always in the brow area, I turn off my X symmetry. Let's turn down the Z intensity on that damp Standard brush. I always try and make sure that the brow furrow is asymmetrical, because they can be similar, but they're very, very rarely perfectly symmetrical. And I think it really helps if you make a concerted effort early on to make some areas like this asymmetrical. It's just going to make the piece look a lot better. I'm going to take the Move brush and just pull that medial canthus forward just a little bit. Almost suggests a nictating membrane there. I'm going to leave a little bit of that. I will mask out the corner of the lower lid. Go to my Clay Tubes brush. I need to zoom in for this. I just want to build up that outer corner of that lid. Bring that around. Put a little bit of fatty tissue under here. Just want to fill out these shapes just a little bit so we get a sense of the eyelid creasing over the lower lid. There we go. And I'll zoom out a little bit so I can Control-click on the background to invert that mask. Take the Move brush and I'll just tug the lower lid up under the upper lid just a little bit, and then execute Dynamesh. So it's quite nice to sculpt this way because you don't need to worry about your subdivision levels. You don't need to worry about, most importantly, the volumes of the model. If I was trying to sculpt all of this from a single sphere, it would not be very easy. I wouldn't be able to extrapolate an entire body from that. So I'm going to come back in with my damp Standard brush, make sure I turn my X symmetry back on, turn up my Z intensity a little bit. I'm going to create some striations from the cheekbone coming down into this flap area here. Let's spread these out once again. And let's bring this down and out, and let's add some tentacles. Now for that, we're going to use a different brush. We're going to go to B for brush, C for curve. And here we have the Curve Tube brush. Now this is also an insert mesh brush. It can be used just like the other insert meshes where it's used with or without Dynamesh. In this case, we're going to create tentacles with it. I'm going to save my work before we move on. Now that we've saved our work, let's go back to this Curve Tube brush and demonstrate how this works. If I click and drag with the curve brush selected, you see what it does is it creates this dotted line, and along that dotted line it creates a tube. Now if I turn up my draw size, that dotted line has fewer dots in it, and the mesh gets larger. If I change my draw size while my cursor is red and then touch that curve, it changes the size of the mesh. Now, while my brush is over the curve, you notice that it's blue. That means I can grab the endpoints of the curve and move them. I can change my draw size, and I can affect the shape of the curve itself. Now, if I change my draw size over here while my brush is red, that changes the size of the mesh. So what we want to do is we want to use these tubes to create some tentacles coming out of the face here. So let's undo back before we drew those curves. We're on the curved tube brush, and let's draw the first set of tentacles here. I'm going to click and drag and just draw a tube coming out of the mouth here. I'm going to take the start point and I'm going to bring it up inside these mouth sort of flaps here, like that. Now, obviously they don't look like tentacles yet. They look like, regular tubes. So I'm going to go to the stroke menu, and we'll tear off the stroke menu and dock it on the side of the screen. We'll open up the curve menu here, and you see that we've got some options for the curve menu. Now, if snap is turned on, it will cause the endpoints or the points of the curve to snap to the surface. I have that turned off so I can take those endpoints and move them inside the head. I can lock the start and lock the endpoint. So I'm going to lock the start point because I'm happy with where that is now. That means I can grab the endpoint and I can move it around, and that start point stays in its position. Now I will go to Curve Modifiers. Under Curve Modifiers, I have the Size option here. I'm going to click Size and click Curve Fall Off. Now this point represents the size of the mesh at the start point, and this represents the size of the mesh at the end point. I'm going to flip this vertically so it goes from big to small, because that's the start point and that's the end point. So once that's turned on, just click the mesh, and there you can see it changes the taper. Maybe I don't want it to taper down to a perfect point, so I'll bring the end point up slightly and then tap the mesh again, and it starts to feel a little bit more tentacle-ish. There we are. So if I'm happy with that, I'll just tap somewhere off the model, and that curve now goes away. And this is now a mesh that I can manipulate with the Move brush. If I want to come in here and just do some tweaks to this before I Dynamesh it, I can do that. Maybe we want to bring these up like that. And then I will Control, click, and drag once on the background. Control, click, and drag once more to execute Dynamesh. And now these tentacles, if we go into frame mode, you can see they're part of the mesh. So let's do that again. Let's create some smaller ones. We'll go back to our curve brush, B for brush, C for curve, grab curve tube, and let's do some smaller ones here. I'll turn my draw size down and just draw some smaller tentacles here. We'll take that end point and let's bring it inside the head. Now I still have the start point locked, so I can bring these down and change their shape. Now these are being drawn symmetrically, and if I wanted to draw them asymmetrically, I could definitely do that. I would just turn off X symmetry, and then I would be working asymmetrically. With tentacles, just like with fingers and toes, you want to be careful that your resolution is high enough that it doesn't merge them together. Let's do this. Now, if I want to extend that curve, I can go to Stroke, and I can turn on, under Curve mode, turn on Elastic. If I grab the endpoint now, I can stretch it out. Or I can grab a point along the length of the curve, and it will stretch in between those 2 points. Now if I'm happy with that, tap somewhere off the model, or off the curve, that gets rid of the curve, and then Control, click, and drag twice, and that will merge those together. Just hit that with a little bit of smooth, and there we go. Now maybe I want to work asymmetrically for the rest of these. I'll go back to my curve tube brush. Let's turn off X symmetry. And let's go ahead and draw a few more tentacles coming out of the mouth. I find it quite easy, if I want to work into a tight area like this, to make a proxy object. I will append a polymesh star into the model. I will select it, and I will turn that into a polysphere. I'll take that polysphere and I'll place it inside the mouth here, where I want those tentacles to come from. I'll turn on X symmetry. And I'll just spread this out. Oops. Make sure I'm on the Move brush. I use the move brush to spread this out. This is just going to be a proxy object from which I'm going to grow my tentacles. There we go. Now, turn on solo mode and go back to my curve tube brush. Turn off X symmetry and let's just draw a few smaller tentacles coming out of this. Turn off solo so we can see where that's going. I'll go to the stroke menu and I'll turn off elastic and I'll grab that endpoint and let's just bring this down, make these feel like they're coming down like this. If I'm happy with that, I'll go back up to my curve menu, go to curve functions, and there is a snapshot button here. If I press snapshot, it snapshots that curve, so I can grab the end point now, and you see that first tentacle is where I left it. It's been snapshotted there. I'll grab this one, and let's make some changes to this shape. There, we're getting an asymmetrical tentacle now. We'll snapshot that. We'll grab this end point, or we can just grab the curve itself. Move this curve so we can have these sort of interacting a little bit. Let's bring this one like this, like so, and snapshot that. We'll grab that start point and move it over here so we're getting this tentacle coming from a different area. Maybe these are kind of like rolling over each other a little bit, but be careful not to get them too close together or you run the risk of them merging when you Dynamesh. And again, if that does happen, simply increasing your resolution of your Dynamesh will correct that problem. There we go. We'll snapshot that. Now let's create another one. Let's make this one a bit shorter. We'll bring this down deeper inside the mouth. I have to grab that endpoint, so I have to zoom in here and get that endpoint. Let's turn on solo so we can see it a bit easier. There we go. Let's bring that down. Let's turn our draw size up and let's change this curve here. Let's turn off solo so we can see where this is coming from. Make sure that those are not crashing into any of the other tentacles. When we're happy with that, we can snapshot that, and then let's move this one more time. We'll make one more. I'll go to solo so I can actually get that endpoint a bit easier. Bring it up here. Let's make this one sort of reach out. So it's reaching out to say hello with its little mouth tentacles. Maybe that's how it smells things. Maybe it's trying to decide if we're food or not. Turn our draw size down while the brush is blue. That allows us to change the shape of the curve brush. Let's turn off solo so we can see where this is sitting. It's a bit too centralized, so I'm going to move this over just a little bit. Again, taking care to make sure that it doesn't stray too close to the other tentacles or touch them. Quite happy with that, so we'll snapshot it. And then we'll do one more coming from the other side. Turn off solo so we get a clear idea of where these are going in relation to all the other bits and pieces that we've added. Let's bring this way. Let's bring this up. And there we go. So we've got a series of these tentacles now. Tap somewhere off the model. Control, click, and drag to clear the mask. Now this is not Dynameshed yet. I'll go back to my subtool menu. Take these tentacles and let's step them up. Now I could leave this as a separate subtool, but what I do want to do is I want to merge them together with the body. So I'm going to go into solo mode. I want to get rid of this proxy object, that sphere that I use to actually draw these tentacles. So I'll Control-Shift-Click on it twice to hide it. Then I will go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and press Delete Hidden, and that deletes that piece. Now if we turn off solo, like I said, it's perfectly reasonable to go ahead and keep these tentacles as a separate subtool if you want to, and then merge them down later, or just continue to keep them separate. It sort of depends on what your aims are and what your final product is going to be. I would like them to actually be merged into the mesh. Just that's the way I'm going to work with it, and I think it'll be nice to see it that way, and for you to see it work that way. So I'm going to go back to the body, and let's go to Geometry and check our resolution. So we'll go to Dynamesh, Z-Remesher, excuse me, not ZRemesh, Dynamesh, and our resolution is 104. Now these tentacles are kind of close together, so I think we could benefit from increasing our resolution. So I'm going to turn the resolution slider up to say 432, and then we'll execute Dynamesh, and that's going to give us a lot more resolution on this mesh. Now I'm going to go to Subtool. I'm going to come up here to the tentacle subtool, and I'm going to go to Merge, Merge Down, and click OK. Now that merged this into the Dynamesh. Go to my geometry menu, and you'll notice that's turned Dynamesh off. So let's bring this back up to, I think that was 432, and then Dynamesh. And there you go. It is now Dynamesh those tentacles in. And you'll notice because I had my resolution set so high, it didn't merge them together except in this part here where they're literally sitting right next to each other. But for the purposes of like a design sculpt like this, it's not a problem. We'll go ahead and smooth these, take away those facets. And then we'll go to our damn standard brush, turn on X symmetry, and we can create some interesting little shapes along the length of these main tentacles here. I just want to create some sort of twisting striations along the length of this, just to add some visual interest. And I'm going to use the damn standard brush to put a little bit of creasing through here, some sort of interesting organic shapes, just to break up this area and make it feel a bit more interesting. And there we go. I'm going to turn down my Z intensity just a little bit, and I'm just going to come up here and do a little bit of wrinkling and detailing here through the sides of the head. I like to sketch with the damn standard brush, just sort of drawing in the direction that I think the wrinkles would flow or the flesh would fold, just to help break things up and get an idea of where pieces and shapes will go. Turn off X symmetry once I get towards the center line of the head. Always try and do that. Like your main volumes, your main sort of skeletal structure can be symmetrical. Doesn't hurt to add a little bit of asymmetry there, but any sort of details or things like that, I try and be quite asymmetrical in that area. So we'll mask into the eye sockets here, or not mask, pardon me, use the clay tubes brush to create some eye bags here, and then let's return to the rest of the body. So I'd like to give some anatomy here to the shoulder, so I'm going to go back to my Insert Primitives brush, and I'll select that insert sphere, click and drag, and we're going to create pectoralis muscles. We'll take these and move them into position. Take the Move brush, and I'm going to take the pectoralis muscle, and I'm going to press it up against the clavicle here because it actually has 3 heads. It has a head that attaches to the clavicle. It has a head that attaches to the sternum. And then the tail of it, so to speak, stretches all the way down here and actually attaches to the humerus underneath the deltoid and bicep. So let's move that back, smooth that down. And by default, we're already starting to get this little indentation right here called the infraclavicular fossa. It's a little hollow between the deltoid and the pectoralis muscle, which is a nice landmark to get. So I just want to make sure that this muscle is following the angle that it needs to go. This is a great way to sort of study and learn anatomy too, is to build up a figure just using primitives like this. Control, click, and drag twice to execute Dynamesh. Now we can smooth those transitional areas, going with our clay tubes brush, and sort of build these shapes up. Let's get those striations in the pectoralis muscle visible. Let's build up the shapes of the rib cage here. Let's come around here to the back, and I want to make sure that I'm getting the back wall of the armpit. I like it when this is actually kind of visible from the front. It gives a sense of there being a trapezius there, and the muscles coming off the scapula. There's actually a teres major and teres minor coming off the scapula and grabbing the humerus, and it's important to get those. A lot of times people forget how deep the armpit actually should be, and they neglect to put that in there. I'm going to take the clay tubes brush and just stroke along the flank there. That's the lateral oblique. Get a little bit of a tummy here. I like a little pendulous sort of belly there. Bring that up. I'll take my damn standard brush and sort of stroke along that area there. Take the standard brush, and I want to really accentuate the arch of that rib cage. There we go. Take my damn standard brush again. And I think something I tell a lot of my students at Gnomon Online, my online classes, is that it's great to study anatomy and learn as much as you can, but the bare minimum that can get you by is to understand where the origin, the start, and the insertion, the end of a muscle is. The muscle always pulls towards its origin. And then if you just take your damn standard or your clay tubes brush and just sort of stroke in the general direction of the muscle, you can get quite far just with that. A lot of times I think it's almost detrimental to sculpt too much anatomy on the surface, because then it stops feeling like there's flesh over the muscle and bone. It starts to just feel like an anatomy study. So just being able to have that sort of subtlety of stroking just in the direction of the flow of the muscle can be quite handy. So let's go back in with our standard brush, and I'm going to change to alpha 1, and I'm just going to hold down the control key, and I just want to sort of suggest some ribs here. We don't have to draw every single one. I just want to get the suggestion of them in there. And then I'm going to make sure that I push in that armpit, because that rib cage does angle up in here. Take the move brush and pull that out. You'll see why we just did those ribs like that in just a moment. I'm going to smooth that back. Now I'm going to take my clay tubes brush, and I will change to alpha 58. And alpha 58 is great. I love this brush with the clay tubes brush, because if I start in the recess here and then just drag the stroke along those ribs, it starts to create this nice sense of skin stretching over those high points of the ribs. See that? It's just a neat trick I like to use, stroking across a recess. Oops, hit that with smooth. Going with our clay tubes brush, let's fill in that hollow of the infraclavicular fossa there. Smooth that, and then execute Dynamesh. Now our Dynamesh resolution is high enough that it will pick up this detail. I'm going to go back in with my clay tubes brush. Let's change to no alpha, and just make sure that we get that deltoid blocked in there. Take the move brush, and let's tweak our clavicle. The clavicle has sort of 3/3 to it, and it looks like a handlebars. It looks like handlebars off a bicycle. There's the first third right here, which is where the pectoralis muscle attaches, and the sternocleidomastoid. The second third here is sort of on its own. There's really nothing attaching to it on the underside, which is why it creates this nice little hollow there. You'll see that landmark a lot in sculptures. You'll see it in very, very fit people, as well as very, very, very skinny people. And the third third is up here, and that forms this little bony landmark at the center of the deltoid. That's also where the spine of the scapula attaches back here, so we can actually suggest that, since it's a very skinny sort of character. Take our move brush and just adjust these shapes. Let's come around to the back here, and let's build up the traps. I think I called this the trapezius earlier. That's the lats. The traps are up here. So let's bring up the sense of the muscles that are attaching along the spine of the scapula there. Let's extend those up towards the base of the skull. And now we get a much better silhouette here. Turn on perspective, and we're starting to get a very, very interesting character. Now I can do quite a bit of sculpting of detail in Dynamesh mode, and if you prefer doing it that way, you absolutely can. Typically, I don't work that way. I usually do all of my detailing in subdivision mode once I've converted this back into a subdivision model, because again, I consider Dynamesh to be a design tool more than a pure sculpting tool. I use it to establish volumes and shapes. Over here on the back, I want to make sure that the deltoid is attaching along the underside of the spine of the scapula there. Again, just stroke in the general direction of the origin and the insertion of the muscle, and it'll get you pretty far. Take my damn standard brush and just suggest some muscle striations here. But yeah, I prefer converting this to a subdivision model and then going in and adding subdivision levels and detailing. But it's sort of up to your own preference. I recommend you try both to see which one works best for you, and go from there. We're going to actually convert this into a subdivision model in just a moment. Just want to smooth through all of that. Let's come in here and go in with our damn standard brush. Let's add a little navel there. Do a little inflate so it's a little outy. Take a little standard brush there, create a little fold of skin there, and maybe fill out that with the clay tubes brush. I like to take the clay tubes brush and do little circular patterns to create sort of cellulite. It just makes an interesting little surface there. It's something very, very similar I used to do years and years ago with the inflate brush, where I would turn the focal shift up and the draw size down and just create this mild sort of noisy pattern in the skin there where I want it to feel fatty. Take the damn standard brush and let's do a couple little creases just above the pubic bone where that fat layer is. Roll that up over this bony landmark here of the iliac crest. Remember, that's the pelvis right there. Oops, that's too strong because I have this alpha turned on. So let's turn that off. Turn our Z intensity down. Just make sure that we get that. Put a little crease over that landmark so we're getting that muscle flow there. There we go. Now, I want to turn this into a subdivision model to carry on sculpting. To do that, I will go to the Subtool menu. First off, let's save our work. I'm going to close the stroke menu and I'm going to go ahead and save this. By the way, most of the files that I work with through the course of these videos, I do make available in the download file for you. So you should be able to download this as well as other demo files for all the lectures, so you can actually have access to them if you want to follow along or create your own. So with the body selected, I'm going to duplicate that subtool and I'm going to turn on solo, so I'm hiding everybody else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remesh this with Z Remesher, and then I'm going to project it back onto the high res to get the detail. So watch. I'll go to Geometry, I will turn off Dynamesh and go to Z Remesher. I'll set my target polygon count. 5 is probably okay. We'll have to see. I might want it to be a bit more. Now notice I have X-symmetry turned on. However, I made it a point to make these tentacles asymmetrical. So I need to turn off X-symmetry so the resulting remesh doesn't cancel out all that asymmetry and give me a symmetrical mesh. So let's click Remesh, and ZBrush will start to process the model. If you look at the top of the screen, it says Z-Remesh in progress, and it starts to automate the process of creating a new base mesh based on the volume that I established with the poly count that I requested. Now, 5,000, like I said, we might need a little bit more to accommodate those tentacles, but we'll see. It should complete just any moment now. And here you can see our remesh is complete, and it actually works quite nicely. Now remember, we duplicated the mesh, so here we have the high resolution Dynamesh with all the detail. Here we have the newly remeshed version. So I'm going to turn off visibility on the eyes, because what I'm going to do is divide this mesh and then project it onto the high res to capture all the detail. So this is going to be my subdivision model. I'm going to Control D to add one subdivision level. I'll go to the projection menu here, and I don't need color, so you can turn off color, and I'll just click Project All. I need to make sure that the other subtool is visible. Now I can turn on Solo, and often do, so I just see the detail appear on this mesh. As long as that eyeball is on, it will project onto that mesh, which is why we turn the eyeballs off, because I don't want to project onto the eyeballs. So click Project All, and you'll see it start to capture detail almost immediately. Let's divide again. Click Project All. And let's divide one more time. Watch the detail through here. Project All. And you can see that we're starting to pick up all that detail. If I switch to the Dynamesh and then switch to my projection model, you can see that the two are indistinguishable at this point. So I can select the Dynamesh version here, and I can now delete that subtool. And this is my subdivision model version, which carries all the same detail but has subdivision levels. And because I have subdivision levels now, I can do things like pose it. I can use transpose posing to pose the model. I can give it UVs and extract maps and render it outside of Zbrush where it can be animated. There's any number of things and reasons why you would want to remesh the model. The main one for me being I find it easier to work on a mesh that has subdivision levels because I can continue to step up and down and make changes as required. So for example, on the eyes, I'll mask out the eye area, invert the mask, and then I'll just step down my subdivision levels. And I can take the move brush, and it's much, much easier to move the eyelids when you're just moving a few hundred faces compared to moving thousands or millions of faces. So I can pull these eyelids out a little bit. I can change the shape of the eye. Did not mean to do that asymmetrically, but I actually kind of like the look of that one squinty eye. Bring this down, do a little bit of smoothing there, and then we'll step down and do a little bit of changing of this version, or this side of the eye here. Let's mask out the eye here, invert the mask. Let's step down one more subdivision level, and here we can just make some big changes. Let's change the thickness of the eyelid, make sure that it's thick enough. If you look at the waterline of your eye, your eyelid, you will notice the eyelids tend to be thicker than you might think. They cast a shadow on the eye. They have all sorts of effects that if it's too thin, you're not really going to get accurately. So that's a nice thing to get in there. And then maybe we'll take this lower lid and bring this up just a bit. I'll mask out the upper lid so we don't end up affecting it with our move brush. There we go. Then I can step back up my subdivision levels. So it's much, much easier, I find, to work when you have subdivision levels that you can step up and down in. And I can come back in now and refine the forms. Now, like I say, I consider Dynamesh to be a sketching tool and a design tool. I use it to establish the overall volumes of the character. And once those volumes are in place, then I don't see a reason why I shouldn't bounce it back down into a subdivision model to continue sculpting and then ultimately detailing the model. To me, it's a much more efficient way of working that actually helps you create better form because you're not struggling with millions of polygons at one time. It's perfect for design. It's perfect to get the volumes there, but once you've got them, turn it into a subdivision model. Now, this is how I work when I'm doing design work at work, and very, very, very often they'll come back and say, oh, yeah, well, we got to change to this. We want such and such. This character now has horns, or this character now has extra tentacles coming out of its nipples. You know, there could be any number of changes. And that's simple. You simply Dynamesh your model again by going to Geometry, Dynamesh it again with a resolution high enough to maintain your detail, make your changes, and then repeat the process of bouncing it back down into a subdivision model. So hopefully you found this video helpful. I think this is one of the most fun ways of sculpting in ZBrush because it's the closest analog to me for sculpting in clay. Just taking primitives, mushing them together, and then creating shapes from them and extrapolating a figure. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.